This session, like the last, will be recorded and archived online so that you're able to view it and pass it on to friends and that type of thing. So today, as our special guest, we have Bishop Will Willimon. Now, Bishop Willimon, many of you know, he was the dean of Duke Chapel when I first met him as a student at Duke Divinity School. Then he became a United Methodist bishop, served in the North Alabama Annual Conference, and then retired and came right back to start causing trouble in Durham again, which is one of his favorite things to do. And so the bishop is back. He's teaching at Duke, also leading the Doctor of Ministry program at Duke Divinity School. That's begun this year. And so we're delighted to have Bishop Willimon. Folks have been asking me all week, so what do you think he's going to say? And I've said, even if we talked about it before, I still would not be exactly sure what he's going to say, but I can assure you that it's going to be good. And so I want you to give a University Church welcome to Bishop Will Willimon.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here, and it's great to see. I have been in ministry with Justin and with Daniel and Creighton in various places. Creighton was one of my pastors back in Alabama. And I thank you for this church. When I was 1 year old, a mob of predominantly taxi drivers from Greenville, my hometown, South Carolina, went to a jail in a little town of Pickens, removed a 19-year-old prisoner from the jail. His name was Willie Earl. And as they saw it, and as vengeance for the death of one of their taxi cab drivers that had been stabbed earlier, they took him out and they beat him and tortured him to death. And then the next day, at the Methodist Church in the little town of Pickens, a young minister who'd been in town just a few months, named Hawley Lynn, was horrified that this lynching had occurred in the town of Pickens, and he called, got in contact with a couple other churches in town, and had a public meeting for the purpose of condemning the lynching. And the meeting was held on like Thursday night, and it was broken up by a crowd of people who said the lynchers should be honored for saving the government a lot of money and trial and all, and the thing broke up in pandemonium. And one of Hawley Lynn's church members said, "Well, son, you've done all you can. We just, it probably better just to let this thing lie." Hawley Lynn went home. His wife had died in childbirth just 2 months before, so he had care of a little baby. And Hawley Lynn went home and immediately started working on a sermon in response to the lynching. And the sermon he preached a week later, and the title of the sermon was "Who Lynched Willie Earl?" And in the sermon he started and he said, my topic is "Who Lynched Willie Earl?" And we all know some men from another county came into our jail and they took this young man out and killed him. We even have their names in the paper. The lynchers confessed. They were proud of what they did. They saw what they did as a civic. Anyway, so he went on like that, and he said, "But And he paused for effect in the sermon, and he said, "But who lynched Willie Earl? We lynched Willie Earl." And he then went into a stem winder of a sermon in which he connected South Carolina's legally enforced racial segregation to the culture that creates violent acts like lynching. And he preached on this subject. I grew up in Greenville. As I said, this happened when I was 1 year old. It was not until I went to college that I heard of the lynching in Greenville. And by the way, the lynching was followed by a trial 2 months later in which all of the lynchers, despite their confessions, were exonerated. And no one was convicted, and so it was kind of a double tragedy. Interesting enough, one of my professors mentioned about the lynching in Greenville, and I said, "Lynching? What lynching?" And he said, "Well, that's true. They only had 18 years. They couldn't get around telling you about everything about Greenville." But so thus began my own journey into this event. But for purposes of this afternoon, I just want to simply say that as Christians, one of the claims of our faith, whether we make it very often or not, is that we have the resources to talk about things the world finds tough to talk about. Holly Lynn spoke up and preached and tried to help his church think about this horrible event like Christians. By the way, we were only able to find one other preacher in South Carolina that preached on this lynching, a Baptist preacher in a textile town above Greenville. And however, Holly Lynn's sermon was later run on the front page of the South Carolina Methodist Advocate and became a kind of honored artifact from Methodism's past in South Carolina. And so this afternoon, we're gathered to talk about race like Christians. And we have in our past both widespread denial and silence on issues of race and courageous witness of people who talk about this subject. I know as a preacher, it's people say it's hard for white America to talk about race. We get jittery. I grew up in South Carolina, frequently hearing the mantra, it's not about race, it's about states' rights. It's not about race, it's about strict constitutional construction. So there's all these mechanisms of avoidance of talking about anything but talking about race and deflecting and talking about everything. But I wonder if, I as a preacher, if maybe I'm at somewhat of an advantage in that I, on a regular basis, have everybody be quiet and sit still, and then I stand up and I say, now we're going to talk about something that you've been avoiding thinking about all week. I'm going to force us to talk about it. I'm going to put this on the table. I'm going to put it out there. So, in a way, I'm saying church is sort of where you come to have conversations that it's difficult for 9 out of 10 Americans to have, and race being one of them. How do we think about, and therefore talk about racism, racial injustice, racialized thinking as Christians? Well, I'd like to share a few things that I think we think about that I found helpful and difficult. To me, the first thing is that when Christians talk, we often talk with Scripture. And when I preach, there's usually always a Scripture text, and then we're off for a sermon related to that Scripture text. Race, as we use it and as it has impacted American history, is really not a biblical idea. I think that's the first challenge. In that Scripture, Old Testament and New, really doesn't understand our North American way of considering race as an important designating characteristic of people. The Bible talks about different peoples, different tribes, the nations, but never does it talk about it in a way we talk about race. The whole concept of race as a significant human designator really stems from the European Enlightenment, not from Scripture. In the European Enlightenment, people like Locke, Voltaire, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, other Enlightenment figures spoke about race, about inferior races and superior races, and certain human characteristics were ascribed to races and all. Notably, the superiority was always in the white race. There was from the beginning a kind of sense that to be white is not to be raced. It's not to have a race. It's white people are normal and the summit of human development, and then you've got all these other races that don't look white, and that's deemed to be significant. Notably, the European Enlightenment, which gave us many noble things, Enlightenment thinking, the U.S. Constitution, etc., but it also gave us European imperialism, and it's hard to know kind of which came first. Did European imperialism need an ideology to justify domination, overtaking, robbing certain peoples? Or did our racial thinking then give impetus to imperialism's overcoming by Europeans taking over land and peoples elsewhere? Probably it's enough to just say that it's interesting how the two go together. And so we see that the concept of race is an invention, an intellectual invention from Europe to the world, and it also is connected to power from the first. It's who has power, and how can that power be justified by disempowering others on the basis of race. So from the beginning, it had this history. And Patsy's just read John Meacham's new book on the presidency, and noting that, if you're going to argue, gee, we've got the most questionable presidency we've ever had, you got history to deal with. But she was just noting, like, Teddy Roosevelt, his stuff about the things he said about Filipinos and Asia and all, and he said that Roosevelt said, I really didn't know what a big factor race is until I went to Harvard. And at Harvard, in Harvard history classes, at the beginning of the century and all, sociology, everything fed together to undergird the notion of the white race and white supremacy. And so, so that was kind of my first point, that it's a non. However, even though race as we use the term and think of it is a non-biblical idea, the closest analogy we have, at least in the New Testament, is what New Testament writers say about the Gentiles. In fact, running underneath the whole New Testament, this isn't always obvious. Sometimes you have to look at it close. But running underneath there is basically the shock of Jews asking themselves, has God's salvation gone even to the Gentiles? The promises of God in the Old Testament are to God's people, Israel. I will make of you a great people. You are my people. I will preserve you. I will bless you. Well, soon after the death and resurrection of Jesus, Jews were surprised. There were some Jews who looked at Jesus and said, oh, that's our long-awaited Messiah. We've got to redefine Messiah, but that's our Messiah. But the shock was these pagans, these Gentiles started showing up and saying, hey, he's my Messiah too. And this is behind a lot of episodes in the Gospels, where Jesus is criticized for fraternizing with Gentiles on occasion and healing them and all. But in Paul's letters, you really see this, where Paul is dealing with a huge problem, and that is the church gathers, and the church has been gathered by two groups of people that hate each other deeply. Gentiles were the Romans. Gentiles were the ones who had persecuted God's people. Gentiles were the enemy. What do you do when suddenly you look out and you got Jews and Gentiles in the congregation? And you hear Paul say things like, welcome one another as Christ has welcomed you. Or Paul would say, wait a minute, the Gentiles aren't God's enemy. You are. Israel is God's worst problem. So you see Paul using a wide array of arguments, and Justin quoted this morning where Paul says, you Jewish Christians don't have anything on these Gentile Christians because you're all baptized. And in baptism, all these silly, sinful distinctions just get washed away. Gender distinctions. There's neither male nor female. There's neither slave nor free. And you see Paul using a wide array of arguments to try to deal with what in the world do we do with these Gentiles here? And in a number of places, Paul kind of flips it and says, what in the world are these poor Gentiles going to do with you? Some of you acting like your circumcision is like your badge of honor, makes you special, your parents and all. No. And that's a theme that runs through, that all of us are Christians, not because of any of our personal characteristics or the way we think or the way we look or the way we act, but we're Christians because of an act of God, because God bringing us in, bringing us together. I had a preacher back in Alabama when we were in the immigration fight with Jefferson Beauregard Sessoms and all, who couldn't come up with the worst immigration law in the country without getting help from Duke graduate.
Stephen Miller.
Thank you. See, it was very painful. but I thought I would throw that out to you as a little ingratiating gesture. Anyway, anyway, he preached a sermon in which he said, in this church, you are forbidden to use the phrase undocumented or alien about another human being. And because we're Christians, let's get this straight. We were all undocumented as far as God was concerned until God naturalized us. And then he preached, he said, if you're a Christian, you cannot be born in the Christian faith. It doesn't make any difference if your parents are Christian. Everybody here is an immigrant into this faith. Everybody here had to come over the border. And he was quoting Paul talking about once you were enemies of God, there was a wall between you and God, and Jesus Christ knocked down the wall. Anyway, so what I'm saying is that while race is not a biblical category, I think we have wonderful biblical sources for for thinking about and dealing with this issue. And here, let me just tick off some ways that I have found helpful. One is that when we talk about the issue of race, I think it's okay to say there is no biblical justification for thinking racially. However, we live in a society where racialized thinking is real. It is a reality, it is a fact, and it makes a lot of people's lives less livable. And I'm not only thinking about persons of color who are victimized by racialized injustice, but I'm thinking about people who look like me, who have taken God's world and laid over people these designators for purposes of putting them down. Race is real, and in a way I think about it, it's one way to think of it. Racial thinking is sinful thinking. And yet we do all kinds of sinful thinking. I think I could argue from American history and all, race is America's peculiar sin. It is our original sin, as Jim Wallace has said, in that so much of our history is explained by this idea being given legislative, economic, educational force and organized into the way that we organize ourselves. So I think it's important to recognize that this is a reality and to call it a sin. Methodists don't talk about sin much anymore, like in one day we used to. Or if we think of sin, we often think of it as something personal that we do bad, that we shouldn't be doing, and yet we do it, and that's sinful. Historically, Justin could explain this to you, but no, sin is not so much what you do wrong, it's how you are wrong. It's you, deep. I think about bias, for instance. Every human being, I think, has biases. That's kind of natural and normal. And we're born like that. And we take in biases and all. And yet, we're mostly unconscious of our biases. Generally, we don't know we have biases till somebody points it out to us, shows it. And we do some of the dumbest things we do, and some of the most hurtful things we do out of those biases. And that's kind of the way sin is. Sin is to be against God, but often in ways we don't have any control over or knowledge of or thought about. So it's sinful. Here's another thing I've found helpful. I think it's very important for people who look like me I don't mean people who look like old and degraded, but I mean the rest of me. I think it's important for white people to look upon ourselves as members of a race. One thing we do in America we've done is to think of white as normal and natural and American. And as Langston Hughes first pointed out, Asians came to America and they became honorary white people after education and assimilation and all. Well, that was not granted to African Americans. I think it's very important for us to, heard a woman on NPR this morning, and she was talking about identity politics. And she said, the thing that gets me is when people don't recognize that all of us respond politically on the basis of certain allegiances and identities. And she said, how come identity politics is bad just because certain persons of color say your color makes a big difference in how you see the world and vote and all, and yet white people won't come clean about their identity politics. She also noted a nefarious way that said, you know, when you stand up and say, I'm a nationalist, he said, no, I'm not talking about neo-Nazis and all that. Well, he said that becomes identity politics. When you talk about we've got to protect our borders against their overrunning us and taking away our jobs, or we've got to make this country great again. It slid a little bit, but we got to get it great. She said that most people of color they can hear that. They hear the identity-forming qualities of that speech. So I think it's important for me to realize that I have a race, and my race has benefited and been privileged by certain aspects of the world that we set up to benefit, you know. And I don't have to have hatred in my heart. I don't have to feel a favorite thing for people like me is to say, I am not a racist. And somebody could say, well, so what? I mean, yeah, but you benefit from certain racial ideas and systems that have been set up. And I think it's important for Christians to sort of say, you know, the issue is not so much outright racism. The issue is, or deeper and often more detrimental issues are issues of bias and systems, the way they're set up, that enable you to go into a newborn nursery anywhere in America, and if you see a white baby and like an African American, a black baby, and they're in the nursery together, you can predict very closely which child will live longer, which one will receive more education than the other, which one will earn more money. So this is kind of the air we breathe, and it's deep and subtle, and I think the worst part about that is when it's unacknowledged. Even to just simply acknowledge, I wonder how many ways my race has put me where I am and given me the things I've received. And I think, and by the way, you know, if you grew up in the South like I did in South Carolina, in a curious way, I think it gives you it can give you a certain advantage in talking about these matters, because you've grown up hearing a lot of deceitful lies, such as it's not about race, it's about the Constitution, interpretation, and all. You also will hear people say, you know, race is only a problem because of a few redneck, uneducated white people. I've got African American friends is that they love the way many times they're meeting a white person, they want to get over to you in the first few minutes, I'm a good white person. I'm not like all those white people that live in other parts of town that can't get admitted to this university. I'm a different white person. I'm one of the good guys, you know. Well, I think one thing we're learning as we look into issues of power and structures and all is, well, I'll just say this. In Greenville, as I researched on the Willie Earl lynching, the narrative in Greenville was you have these ignorant, sad, dispossessed white people, and they got into a mob and they drank a lot of liquor, because a lot of them do that, and they went over and committed this lynching. Well, the lie to that was put during the trial, where the trial was conducted by the best, most privileged legal minds in Greenville. They did the trial. And at the end of the day, you wonder which was a greater injustice and which way. So I think acknowledging, I wonder if we really realize how weird it is to start worship. And you walk in here and say, I want to be close to God, I want to be spiritual. Then, like, Justin gets up and says, okay, repeat after me. I am wrong. I was bad. Let's all do something our president has never been able to do. Let's admit we may have made a mistake. We love the wrong things. We do. Well, and then Justin tells you we're all forgiven and all. Well, that's not happening all over town. And I just think Gary Wills says, if you're white, male, over 50, from the South, there is no way to convince you people can't change, because you have experienced dramatic changes in your own heart, in your family, among your friends, that you really believe things can change. And I know in Alabama as bishop, it was wonderful when someone would say, Bishop, the church is never going to change this. There's no way you can get this change through. I said, if this were Minnesota, you might have a good argument. Because Minnesotans, all I've known, they're insufferably nice. But hey, this is Alabama. Do you know what we were doing just 20 years ago? Do you know what your parents were doing and your grandparents? We can change, we can be better. And I think that is a word of hope, that I really think a lot of America is tired of talking about race or afraid to talk about it because of a lack of hope. Obama, when Obama spoke down at the Selma Bridge at the anniversary of Bloody Sunday, he said in his remarks there that one of the worst things you can say is there hasn't been any progress. There have not been changes. And he says, don't you try saying something like that to some of these old folks sitting here who were in Selma in 1960. Don't say that. And to deny, Obama said, to deny progress and change in matters of race is to deny our own agency. And then I would add that I think this discussion is hard to have when there are few non-white people in the room. I've got a friend who wanted to do a congregational study of race and have a series of sermons and discussions on race. And to do it, he talked to one of his friends. He said, I know it's a lot to ask, but could you get me about 50 of your members to come over to our church every Wednesday night? We're going to put people at tables, and we're going to have these discussions. Because my friend said, it's just really hard when you don't have living, breathing human beings there to come back and say, I wish you could say that just a little differently, or that's really not how we see it, I think. And which is then to say that the church, I think, ought to be the ideal place for this kind of conversation. This is a prejudiced Christian comment, but I don't know how America is going to have these conversations, because I think it requires such truth-telling and such forgiveness. It requires admission of our own complicity. I don't know how it's going to do it. But Christians, I think, ought to be able to witness to the world, our Savior is so good, he enables even people like me to talk about this, to not lie about it, to not deceive. And so I think this is a mission God has given us in the present moment, to talk. The same mission that Holly Lynn jumped into with his sermon. And by the way, Holly Lynn's sermon, I remember, is such an heroic, memorable thing. Not one single person left his church after that sermon. In fact, I came across a history of Grace Methodist Church in Pickens, South Carolina, and they're 125 years old. And in that history, there's only one sermon included in the history, and it's Holly's sermon. And the church says this was our finest hour. We had a preacher who loved us enough to tell us the truth, and this is Grace Church. When I was 16, my church sent me to a youth conference at Lake Junaluska, from which all good things flow for Methodist in the Southeast. And one of the organizers of the conference said to me as we were registering, said, I hear you're a wonderful boy. Would you be willing to room with a Negro? And I said, I was thinking I will do anything to validate myself as a nice boy. Yes. Yeah. And so I went in there, and here was a 16-year-old sitting on a bed there, and I walked in and put my stuff down, and turns out he was from Greenville. And he went to John Wesley Methodist Church, 5 blocks from my Methodist church. He went to the high school, 4 blocks from my high school. And I don't remember anything about the conference, don't remember the theme, any of the presentations, but about midnight, Charles started talking. And during the conversation, he said, does it bother you that you get on a Greenville bus every day and there's a sign up there that says white patrons sit from the front of the bus, colored patrons sit from the rear of the bus? Does that bother you? And I said, I guess I never thought about it. And he said, okay, that bothers me, that you never thought about it. And he said, by the way, when y'all get to church, do you talk about this kind of thing? Do you? And I said, never. I said, maybe I might hear a conversation about this somewhere else, but not in church. And I remember at some point he said, don't you see, those laws are not to keep me in my place. They keep you in your place. He said, are you going to let them get away with that? He said, you're 16. Yeah. Anyway, when the sun came up over Junaluska, I had the closest thing I think I've ever had to a true, born again, darkness to light, my eyes were open experience. As we were leaving, we embraced, and I said, I'm different because of our talk. And Charles said, when they told me that I had to room with a white boy, I was scared shitless. I said, oh, okay. Anyway, here's my point. What if he had not been color courageous? What if Charles had said, I'm sick of talking to white people. I'm just worn out with it. You'll never change them. I like to think that maybe one reason Charles dared that was he believed in the Holy Spirit. He believed that Jesus Christ is able to produce the people he wants, and that there is a power greater even than my powers of intellect or empathy or that is working in us. I'll stop there and let's talk about the subject of race.
It's got a microphone here. If anyone would like to ask the bishop a question.
Yeah.
Was Charles allowed to swim in the pool?
It was November, but I bet you know the answer to that. Yeah. At Junaluska, there was a guardhouse, as I remember, those first days, and at the guard, they would check you out at the guardhouse, and I'm sure that was part of the intent. This morning, I had a piece of history that I never heard, and that was that the Wesley Foundation was here, and then the Wesley Foundation moved, and as painful as that is to hear, I love it when God leverages our history for us, and it helps us be better than we were bred to be. But yeah.
Other questions?
Yes.
Yeah, why don't we...
Have I ever talked to anybody who's blind? I have talked to people who are blind, but I wonder, it's an interesting question that we who make judgments on the basis of what we can see, I wonder, we don't have any blind people here to tell us what non-sighted people, I wonder. That's a fascinating suggestion. I do remember some plays and movies where someone is, that Steve Martin movie, where he is raised by an African-American family or something, then discovers he's white, and it's sort of a spoof maybe on our racial thinking. I wonder. I know sometimes in these discussions people will say, well, I'm LGBTQ, for instance. There's widespread discrimination and animus against people of my sexual orientation. That is absolutely true, but it's different in that, and I was in a discussion where someone said, when you walk into a bank, your sexual orientation probably won't be a big factor if you ask for a mortgage. If I walk into a bank, the color of my skin is more important than my educational level or my resources or something.
Just as a quick comment, I remember when I got my first car, my father had to co-sign because I had a job and everything else, but that was...
And that may...
That was in the 60s.
It'd be interesting to think now, maybe that gives you a sort of advantage in understanding like bias and discrimination if you've been a victim of that. Maybe that's, I think women's racial attitudes better than men's racial maybe that's the reason. You remember what it was like to have, you got to have a male in here to sign, your daddy to sign for you for the car.
I have just one more quick comment.
Yeah.
When I was whatever age, I read the book Black Like Me.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's still in print. And for those of you who don't know about it, he took some medication that made him black. Mm-hmm. And then he went to the same places that he had gone as a white person and how he was treated.
That book made a big impression on me.
Powerful, maybe.
Yeah. I've also, I remember I was having a casual conversation with one of my assistants at Duke Chapel, African-American minister. And we were sitting there talking, and he said, "Oh yeah, I graduated from Millsaps," and I said I'd been down to Millsaps College, and he said, "Yeah," I said, "I remember," said, I wanted to marry a girl that I met at Millsaps, and said, I got out of the courage to invite her out to supper, and we went. I wanted to take her to a really nice place, so I took her to Shoney's. And she sat there looking at the menu and said, "Gosh, it all looks so good. What are you going to get?" And all, and said, and we sat there, and we sat there, and we sat there. And finally a waitress came by, and I said, "Hello, we need to order." And she said, "Take a hint," and walked off. And he went on chattering, and I said, wait a minute. I'm 40 years old. Nothing like that has ever happened to me, ever. And I said, I'm just stunned. And I'm stunned at the casual way you've reported that. That's horrible. And I said, but let me ask you, just as a Christian, I want you to know that a lot of white people are in awe that you are not completely consumed with anger and resentment and hatred. I just don't understand that. And he said, could be Jesus. I said, all right, fine. All right, yeah. Yeah. And what about, lots of places.
So
Starbucks.
as we do this, we're going to pass the mic around so we make sure that we
Yeah.
capture it on the recording. So, yeah.
I was
I
going to
see.
ask, I just finished the book by Austin Channing Brown, which I think the church has read too, but she talks in there a little bit about that, the buzzword, the church buzzword of reconciliation, and just how that's kind of gotten to become a watered down term in the church. And I don't know, I just wanted to.
Oh, good. What a perceptive comment.
His daughter.
The girl has had good preaching. What can I say? Thank you for pointing me to that book. Austin Channing Brown, her parents named her Austin when she was born because they felt this will be such a boost for her in later life that when she applies for a job, the employer will think she's a white male. And that episode kind of says the whole thing. But reconciliation, why would reconciliation not be a good word? Here's what I've gotten back. One is that, it's often like me, a powerful person, saying to a less powerful person, you need to be reconciled to me. And I need to be reconciled to you, and well, yeah, but a lot of stuff has to happen, and it's probably got to be, a lot of truth telling, a lot of insights. Also, timing is important. What will need to be given in that reconciling work. This morning, as we were riding over here and listening to the news and all, I said, I'm learning it's wrong. It can be difficult to stand up and say, we need to be united. America needs to be united again. Well, there could be people who would say, now when were we ever united? We never felt united to you. Or what that often means is, put aside some real history, some real pain, some real questions, and let's all hold hands and be united. And so I think what does she say?
She kind of talks in it, I think, about just how it's also become a term we use so the church feels good about what it's doing, or like a pat on the back that the church is going through, being reconciling. And
when there's a national tragedy, as we've had many, particularly violence with guns and all, I've even become wary of words like healing. Like somebody saying, let the healing begin. Now let's all get together and heal. well, thinking, well, wait, okay, wait. Could I just be like angry for 24 hours or I remember after the Orlando shooting, I watched policemen handing out candles at a vigil. And suddenly I got so angry thinking, wait a minute, you're the guys that have blessed our gun laws. You're the guys that took 3 hours to get in that nightclub because you were outgunned by the terrorists. I'd like to have something a little better than candles here. Could we do that? Or so I'd like to think our church helps us be wary and critical and say, now who's the one calling for healing? Who's the one calling for unity? Under what terms? Yeah.
So what's driving my question is I'm wondering what is a possible way forward for this congregation? And rather than ask you to write us a prescription, I wonder if you could share with us any success stories that you're aware of for churches like ours, large or small.
Good. I hope you're not saying that. It has often been said to me that I do the pessimism thing better than the optimism. But you didn't ask for optimism, you asked for a way forward. I think it's important to admit truly multiracial congregations are rare, very rare, and they're very unstable. There are some, and we're now studying what dynamics there. There's even a book, The Myth of the Racially Inclusive Congregation, and that written by an African-American woman who says, sometimes a congregation can make racial inclusiveness God at the expense of everything else, and that you can talk about every issue except race, because they're afraid if we put it on the table, it's going to blow up the inclusiveness we've got. But I remember, this isn't really maybe relatable, but we had a new church start in Alabama that wasn't going very well, and they said, you got to get out there, and we don't know what the problem is. Well, by the time I finally got out to the church, it looked thriving to me. The place was well filled and all kind of children, families, and everything. And so I said to the pastor, what happened? Why are you thriving? And I'd heard you were having a tough time 6 months ago getting this going. He said, our first biracial couple showed up and said, I hadn't said much about race, I hadn't focused on, but it said whatever they experienced was good because they came back the next Sunday and brought friends that were a biracial couple with children. And he said, we're up to about our 10th biracial couple, and said, we have one couple that drives 40 miles from Birmingham to be here every Sunday. And he said, I think people are selling short how much some people really want to work on this, really want to be part of a church dealing with this. And so I think it would be great for this church, and conversations like this, I think, can bear such fruit. I do think it began, Justin said in the service today something about, was you talking about, I don't know, the special gathering you're having Tuesday or something, but said invite your friends and all. I know a pastor who was talking on racial justice in his congregation, and he said, we have got to be a more racially inclusive church and all this. And one of the lay people, I love it when lay people do this, said, George, how many African Americans do you come in contact with in a given week? How many extended conversations do you have with an African American person? And he said, well, being the pastor of this church, I don't get to meet a lot of African Americans and all. And so she turned around to the gathered group and says, how many of you in your work during a week, we'll have more than 1 or 2 conversations with an African American person. 2/3 the people raise their hands. She said, George, it appears you need to get out more. And, but George was telling me this story, but he said, I really realized God had already given us so many opportunities to engage with integrity in this conversation, but we weren't using them. And so we said, what would it mean to invite someone, or what it would mean for you to say to that person, hey, invite me to where you worship. I'd like to just visit with you. I'd get to know you better. I think a lot of people are in pain about this. When I wrote the book, Who Lynched Willie Earl, I did a kind of a survey among pastors, and I found all the pastors that I surveyed wanted to talk about race, but the majority of them, the biggest reason they didn't put race out on the table in their church life was, I don't want to say the wrong thing. Many of them, I would say, are good white liberals, and they've said, we need to be reconciled to one another. And then someone has said, wait a minute, that reconciliation is a loaded word. And they said, oh, well, and so I say, put it out there, and I hope you'll have a safe enough, good enough kind of gathering so someone will be able to say, when you put it like that, that's not the best way of talking about this. But I must say, I'm United Methodist, and our church is like 5% of our church is African American, maybe. Our percentage of African Americans has been declining. Maybe I'm the last one to ask this too, but again, I also wonder too, I think I see among younger people a kind of wonderful, casual, I was talking about our upcoming general conference in February, where we're going to spend about $15 million in a week to talk about issues of sexual orientation. And I was talking to a student, a young Methodist preacher-to-be the other day, and he said, he said, have you ever met anybody under 50 that thinks this is important? He said, I just wish all you old guys would get together and fight it out, kill each other off over it. We want to move on and be the church. Well, I wonder on race if they're important generational issues, that maybe the fact that we don't engage this more may be a testimonial to how my generation has stifled a conversation or something.
Yeah, and I just add, Bishop, that I think it's right that multiracial friendships are really the key, particularly in an environment like ours, where there are so many barriers to entry, this side of town, that kind of thing. Churches grow when you bring your friends, and unless you have a diverse friendship group, it's less likely that a church will grow interracially unless it's a very artificial and painful interaction.
And I think in predominantly white congregations, which are most of our congregations in Methodism, we may have to ask some people to be missionaries to us. We may have to ask people to come witness to us and help us talk about these matters. And one great thing the church does is it puts flesh on these issues and moves it away from slogans to real human beings caught in things. And
A couple of things you talked about, and it started last week with understanding what it is to be white. in the world, and what that means.
Interesting.
As we were raising our kids, I coached a lot, and I coached inner city a lot. And a lot of the friends were all kind of ethnicities. A lot of them were black, inner city black. But I didn't understand how white I still was, even though we had them living with us until our daughter wanted to date a black man. And she felt like she had to ask me if that was okay. And that struck me as being, as much as we have welcomed and opened and shared, that there are no differences, somewhere there still are. The second thing that I'm learning, because they are married, and it's very difficult right now because their daughter, our granddaughter, is white, very white. And depending on where we're at, we get odd looks. But the question I ask is, being white, why is it always us asking them to come to us? Why, if that is something that's bothering you, why aren't you going to the black community? Why aren't you getting black friends? Why aren't you going, like you said, where are you coming in contact with not only blacks, Hispanics, any other races? Why are we, I guess we're empowered to say, come to us. What are we doing to go to them, other than the things that I think tend to make us feel good, which is, oh, we're going to go help feed, or we're going to go help the poor, or we're going to go give this, instead of saying, we're going to go and worship with you, or we're going to go to your restaurant, to a black ethnic restaurant, to a black community. And I think that when we start putting those barriers there, we aren't interested in really integrating, or maybe being integrated. And that's understanding what privilege we've had being white, to even have the audacity to say, why aren't they coming to our church? I mean, that's a backwards view to me.
I will remember this as another annoying instance of how you should be teaching this group. I mean, you know more about this than I do. That testimonial that I just heard from you in multiple dimensions, I think is powerful. Your questions, your assertion, thank you. And a good question about what's keeping us from venturing into other situations, from being the minority, by being disempowered, by being... Another thing, are you still coaching?
I'm not.
Because I got a couple grandsons I wanted you to coach after that. But my son and I are sitting at the Carolina Panthers game. We're sitting there looking around at the group and all, and we're talking in the stadium and all, and he said, for any of its faults, this gathering is more racially integrated than any church you've ever served. And I said, shut up. Watch the game. Why is it that so many African Americans excel at sports? I had the former owner of the Carolina Panthers say is because sports is the closest America has ever come to being colorblind. And it's where excellence is honored. and without regard to who your parents are or anything. And he said, isn't it interesting how African Americans have achieved so much, but in a world where excellence is honored above everything. And but that's one. And I love the way you know, and I found out in hearing people's racial stories, white people's racial stories, behind every white person who has really made progress and dealt with this, it's personal. It's a friend, it's somebody you played ball with, it's a child in a relationship with a person of another race. I wonder what the church could do to give us more opportunities for that. Well, yeah, but thank you.
I'm coming at this from a little bit of a different perspective because I grew up in Haiti. My parents took me there as missionary. They were missionaries. Wow. I left North Carolina before the age of 2 and then basically came back to Chapel Hill as a freshman.
Yeah.
And my question is something that I'm starting to grapple with probably in the last 10 years, being a Christian and seeing how missions happened and seeing how actually more and more racist. I wasn't a United Methodist missionary kid, but really tough when I think about asking my dad now that realizing that all those white missionaries, they thought they were so much better, and that's why they were there.
Yeah.
So there was a call to save, but you also were there to help the dumb black people. That is really, and I grew up with some people, and those are my aunts and uncles, but I wonder now how we change that. Because I've known missionary kids from university, Methodist Church, Presbyterian, and we all sort of struggled under that same childhood of we loved that place. And when I got to Chapel Hill, I remember my freshman year where someone said to me, "Oh, that black girl in your suite." That was the first time. I'd been a minority in Haiti, but I didn't know what to say. Black girl in my suite. Who are you talking about?
Yeah.
And so for me, from that day when I arrived in Chapel Hill to now, I'm luckily living back here again after many years, I really hurt to see what missions and what we've done as a church overseas, no doubt, with our Christianness. And I wonder what we can do to make that better moving forward, to really understand that we're going forth in God's love, we've somehow got to get rid of this superiority.
Yeah, and I read a book one time on missionary kids. There's a lot of research on missionary kids. They're high achievers, inordinately intellectual, academic. Is that you? Yeah, I was right. All right. Enough. But our racism has tainted every single activity that I know about in North America. It's part of our history. I teach a course on missions, and we do a lot of talk about how Western imperialism and racism all just worked perfectly with missions, and missions work with that. This summer, I was up in Canada to participate in a conversation about the native schools, the indigenous schools, with all the abuse and everything, where the schools that white Canadian Christians operated for native indigenous Canadians, and where they were not permitted to speak their language, they had to speak English and all. And the church is going through a wrenching time of self-examination and all over that. But I said to them, in one sense, it's absurd having me to talk about this. It's been your issue. However, I'm thinking, I did grow up in South Carolina, and I saw some really sweet, wonderful people do some very sad things and hurtful things. And it's kind of part of the experience. And one of the questions was, have we, because of our sins in the past in mission, have we given up the right, we North American Christians, to be in mission ever, or to evangelize and all? And I said, well, Back when I was growing up in Greenville, you couldn't hear about Jesus except from a racist person. And I said, somehow Jesus Christ managed to work through them and managed to work. So I think it's tough to be honest about our sin and at the same time not paralyzed by it. And Christians don't believe in naming sin. We believe, Jesus wasn't big on saying, you're a sinner, yeah, you're one. But he was big on forgiveness. And I love it in Jesus where he would meet people and say, your sins are forgiven. And you expect him to say, hey, did I mention my sin? I got this bad leg here. It needs to be healed. That's my concern. And he says, go, sin no more. Wait a minute. So we have that kind of God. And Betsy and I have gone on short-term missions to Haiti. And I used to say, I know there are real questions about short-term mission trips. I know there are questions about taking these privileged Duke students to places like this, but darn, for reasons known only to the Lord, he does some of his best work in Haiti. And, or I used to say to people, give me $2,000 and I will mess up a Duke student's brain forever. She will never be able to go in investment banking. God will jump her down in Haiti and again, we have a redemptive God that works through some of our worst evil to do good. But I'm glad your dad raised you. Well, we have one more and then we'll...
Bishop, thank you for being here. And while you're here, would you share with us what you think we might be headed toward as a denomination on the LGBTQ issues in terms of our denomination, our congregations, our clergy, and so forth?
I don't know. I don't. And it's rare that I've ever made that remark. You wrote that down. And what I love is that we have talked about that issue, the way we talk about it, for 5 general conferences. We've never been able to resolve it. So the bishops say, I have an idea. Let's have another general conference only to talk about that. And so I wasn't hopeful. Well, here's the message I've been saying. I don't know what's going to happen. Greg Jones, our dean, says he doesn't think anything's going to happen. He thinks we'll have a general conference and we'll be just all deadlocked and split. And a number of Methodists have decided they don't want to be United Methodist anymore. And so they'll be there discussing. I'm for the one church plan, which makes these matters a local option kind of thing, something to be discussed at the annual conference and local church level. I think we are in bad need of that dynamic in our church, getting stuff. I think all problems are easier on the local level and all. However, that doesn't mean that's solving it for everybody. That may just mean you're postponing inevitable splitting and dislocation. Here's my message, though, for University Church. Whatever happens or doesn't have a general conference, you're going to meet to worship God the next Sunday. I beg you, stay focused on that. I beg you to stay focused on the ways you're already welcoming LGBTQ people and already engaging in ministry with LGBTQ people. I hope General Conference will not stand in your way in that, and I hope you'll continue to, but one of our Methodist sins, I think, is expecting something good to happen from any General Conference. When I think I just think Jesus are any of you delegates to General Conference?
Yeah.
Oh, you
be
are?
there.
Okay, well, talk to him. Yeah, I really, and I love the ways I have seen local churches in Alabama even just work with it and work with and maybe this is somewhat relatable in that just as I've said, race is not a big Bible issue. When you're working with Jesus and the New Testament and everything, sexual orientation, gender, this just doesn't play a big role in our stuff. I wished, one time the Duke Chronicle called me and says, "What does the church believe about homosexuality?" This was years ago. And I said, "Hey, this is kind of complicated. Come over here, let's talk." And the student reporter said, "I got to have a story in 15 minutes." I said, "Oh, God, give me patience." I said, "Well, I'm for everything Jesus said about this, 100%. That was published in the Duke Chronicle. The next day, all these evangelicals calling me up and saying, "Hey, what Bible are you using? Because I don't..." And I said, wow, that is a non-answer that, for me, is an answer. That I think we ought to talk about what Jesus wants to talk about. And, well, thank you all.
Thank you, Bishop. So good to have the bishop here. He is continues to be a friend and an inspiration to me, and so thankful that he was able to share his insights and humor with us today. So next Sunday, it's going to be slightly different. Next Sunday, we're going to have a potluck right after church, and so, we don't do that often here, so, revive your Methodist potluck energies and bring something for the crowd. And then we're going to have a conversation about the show Ugly Delicious. And so I don't know if any of you have seen that show, but as your pastor, I'm giving you the challenge to binge watch as much of a show called Ugly Delicious on Netflix. It's a show that talks about food. And it's both a bit of sociology, but also commentary about race. And so next Sunday, my friend, a seminary classmate of mine, Matt Bridges, are going to model conversations about race and food in an interracial friendship. And so I hope you'll watch the show, bring some questions, and then we're going to try to lift some things out of the show that might be interesting.
Good. Pats and I were here. It was after, I don't know whether it was due to the monument controversy or some Sunday after a memorable week. And Justin reflected his text from Acts, or anyway, we said on the way home, it really is powerful hearing that from an African-American preacher. And he talked about what it was like to walk each day by the car window here. And I'm saying this because I'm still thinking about a sufficient response to the layperson who said, okay, what do we do? You're doing something by having this pastor here. It's a gift to the community, to the church, and I just predict good things. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, a question for me. All right. Did it give me pause to come here as senior pastor knowing that I was going to be in a sea of whiteness, particularly because I'd been an associate here and had swum in the, So, it didn't give us pause for a couple reasons. We thought about it and we considered it, yes. But it didn't give us pause for a couple of reasons. One, because we'd known something of the community and the capacity to love and the compassionate spirit that's present in this place. So we thought that was a good. The second thing that we have known, I was saying this to the bishop of the Texas Conference a couple of weeks ago, that when you look at my appointive history, starting with the SMU Wesley Foundation, here as an associate pastor, St. Luke's in Houston, that if I have a specialty, it's ministering to upwardly mobile white congregations. And it just, I didn't set out that way. It just kind of became the thing. And it's important to me because, and even when I consider, where I grew up, it's important to me because I've always thought that my ability to be in friendship and relationship with people who don't look like me is important. And I've had some amazing conversations. It's hard sometimes. It is, we were talking about, meeting black people and the challenge for y'all to do that. I'm kind of ensconced in such a way that I have trouble meeting black people. It's a challenge for me now. And so, but I do think that I believe in the struggle, and I know that I feel like it's a calling to be here and to be on the journey.
I got to see him create what for me was a multi-ethnic congregation in Houston, and stands out in my mind as one of the most fully with Spanish speakers, African Americans, whites, and it was inspiring to see the work he did there. The great thing is, when he gets exasperated with you and loses it and starts ranting against you, you can say, which the time will come, but you can come and say, "Hey, Justin, you knew what you did."
So it's difficult, certainly for me, and for probably all of us here, to meet African Americans in places in this town. But if you want one opportunity a year, do the MLK Junior Banquet in July. Manuel has
January.
been
January.
Or in January.
Yeah.
Manuel has been championing this on behalf of this community and our congregation for so many years, and we have really great representation for our church, but we could have more. We have 20 or 25. We could have 40. They will welcome us, and it's one time, one night in this town where half of the people there are African American and half are white, more or less. And you sit at tables with people that you don't have a chance to spend an evening with at any other time. And this last January, the most sensational pastoral prayer ever was given by Pastor Justin.
We got to end this thing before this effusive praise. Save it up and measure it out across weeks of the year. That'd be good. Well, blessings, everyone. Thanks for coming. We'll see you next week.